Welcome to Write Volumes One Question. This is where we ask our writers one question, then hear their thoughts on the subject and how it affects them and their writing. My name is Janaea. I'm one of the editors and founders of Write Volumes. Our goal is to give diverse voices an outlet for expressions and to bring attention to diverse writers and their thoughts. In this one question series, we may not discover the right answer. There may not be a right answer, but there are right discussions. The goal is to stimulate conversation, voice potentially alternate perspectives, provide a glimpse of how others view the world, and to expand ideas. Please remember, while we are a range of people on this panel, we are individuals and not a spokesperson for race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or anything. We speak for ourselves, not on behalf of everyone in our tribes or community. People are not stereotypes. We have a voice, and we are our own voice. It seems like society's current process is very adversarial. Us against them, right versus wrong, good versus evil. It's a coin approach, one side versus the other. I view the world and people as in constant motion. I am capable of having more than one side, more than one emotion at a time. I can embody contradictions. The world is large enough to contain multitudes. We all exist. The world isn't static, even with its cyclical nature of day, night, seasons. There are still variations. So why should people be static? Why should we be limited? People are rarely one thing too, and as the world evolves, so can the mind and so can the heart. Thinking and feeling can be a muscle. If we don't exercise them, they won't grow. This series is to help color the world beyond black and white, beyond the coin approach. This will allow for shades of people. Some of the questions in the series stem from biases I discovered in my writing or reading habits and thought it would be interesting to discuss with fellow writers to learn about writing, storytelling, other people, about everything really. So let's listen, let's think, let's feel, let's ask, let's share, let's talk. Here's one question for today. Are the physical description of characters necessary for an engaging story? So we have a panel of writers. What we'll do is have each of the panelists state their thoughts in 2 to 3 minutes max. Then we will discuss it as a group, ask each other questions or make comments. Let me introduce the panel for this question today. Fannie Price resides in the Chicagoland area and enjoys creating stories that bring her hometown and others to life. Sirens and Shades of Horror Strangeness introduced Veronica Sykes to the prior to the challenges confronted in After the Burn, the debut Dragon Rider series novel. Visit FanniePriceNovels.net for updates on her book releases, excerpts, and more. Lin Bo is a software engineer, actor, and painter in Chicago, where he has lived his whole life. He has been fortunate to have many amazing teachers and mentors inspire and guide him to write since grade school. Author of Iceman and Shades of Horror Strangeness, Foreigner, and Shades of Transitions and Transformation. Matthew Vargo lives and writes in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He is pursuing a creative writing MFA at Chatham University and has previously been published in National Gay and Lesbian Review. Author of 2 Hallucinations, 1 Monster, and Shades of Horror Strangeness, Voice, My Jen and I, and Dark Apricot, Sky Turning Plum, and Shades of Transition and Transformation. Michael Dunbar is an aspiring writer from Florida. When he is not documenting his tales of not being your average Florida man, he enjoys traveling the world, dancing, and enjoying the local cuisine. Author of To Kill for Love and Shades of Horror Strangeness, and Venture to Rio and Shades of Transition and Transformation. Okay, so let's begin with Fannie Price. What do you think? Are the physical description of characters necessary for an engaging story?
So for me, not just as a writer, but as a reader, the answer is they are required to pull me into a story. But I think for a writer, it depends, the level of the description that you give comes down to knowing your genre and knowing what your readers expect. You know, giving a more in-depth description allows the writer to play with their characters a little bit more, and it gives more intimacy in the way of how that reader can now visualize what's going on in their world and the people in it. That said, it should not be an info dump. it needs to be the writer's job to play with it and make it fun. So in After the Flesh, for example, Veronica meets Lachlan for the first time in his human form on his boat. And before she even sees him, she hears him. So I'm describing how his voice sounds. So the reader now knows that he has an accent and that he's Welsh. So if they, you know, they can either imagine their favorite Welsh actor, or if they have heard that accent before, it just adds those levels of details to bring the reader into the story more and engages them in that story more. After she sees him for the first time, she's checking him out. She's a cop. She notices detail. He's not turning anybody to stone. So now the reader is seeing what Veronica sees, and they're learning about what he looks like through her eyes. And by doing that, it's less of author intrusion, and it's just more the flow of the story, and it's not pulling anybody out or shocking anybody with this description. It works more naturally. At the same time, I don't think that description needs to be all given at one time. It can be pieced out throughout the story. You know, if your character is the height of a hobbit, so now they have a crook in their neck, and at the end of the day, you know, they're just looking at people like this all day. That's kind of a nice descriptive way to play with the story and give that reader a little bit more of what's happening and what that character looks like. Now, saying that, obviously, not every character is going to deserve the same level of detail, you know? The barista that's in one paragraph of a 300-page novel is not going to have the same degree of detail as your primary, secondary, or even tertiary characters. But I feel at a minimum, there needs to be some level of description of the immediate cast for the reader. For me, I feel that if my readers have to use their imagination to picture what especially my primary characters or my protagonists look like, then I have not done my job as a writer to get that point across. They should be able to picture it, not necessarily have to use their imagination.
Thank you. Lynn, what do you think?
I have a different take on this because I totally agree with Fannie in terms of some of the stories I love have physical descriptions and they're necessary. But in my stories, a lot of them don't have physical characteristics, even the main character, because I'm often writing just personal stories. And so when I'm recounting these stories, I don't actually think about physicality unless it's, you know, very small detail. Like maybe I'll say, oh, you know, my skinny arms, but I won't, even though I'm setting this, say, like in my story, The Foreigner, with me being in China and everyone's Chinese, I don't think about people being Chinese, myself or any of the other main characters. So I want to put the reader in my shoes and not have to think about those either. And I want them to really be able to be completely immersed in whatever my thought process is. So in cases like that, I don't think physical descriptions are necessary if that's not how the character is thinking about their world.
Okay, thank you. Matthew, what do you think?
So I think, stop, Mike. I think description is a tool. So, and it's also really a tool that's meant for the reader. Like, description only exists to help fill in the reader with information that they can't have because they're technically not inside the characters. So whereas like we, you know, go about our normal day-to-day life, and rarely do we catch ourselves in the mirror and we're like, I have long, thick eyebrows and like my hair is a little tousled today, and I'm considering whether or not that tussle will, you know, entice the likes of Susan, the person I'm interested in. I don't know, right? So like when we do description, to me, we're only doing it for the reader, but it's something that the reader probably expects. I don't think though that like we have to have like highly described characters, and there's something like super compelling to me and really interesting in characters that are sort of just like blank slates. And like I'm curious to know, right, like what do you think about that character? What do they look like to you just from your imagination? But I think that like that choice has consequences. So if you do withhold a lot of description, then maybe your reader won't follow you for as long as you want them to. Maybe they'll get frustrated. They'll be like, wow, I'm just in a void, nothing to like grab onto, right? And that's all I really want. So I think it's like important to play with it, rewrite your stories, and like think about how description is interacting with that basically illumination of the reader that is the function of description.
Thank you, Matthew. Michael, what do you think?
I think it's a great question. So for me, since really all I've done so far are short stories to really develop, I can only speak from that from the most part. Like for me, I feel from my writing that I haven't done anything description wise, and I find, well, one is because it's a lot of my own personal experiences in Orlin where I'm tapping into, not the horror story. So don't look at me, Matt. but for the most part, I'm just trying to describe a scene. I'm just trying to describe a story in a very condensed format in the short stories, and really tapping into the emotional aspects of the reader. So to draw them in and really allow them to feel, if they were in that situation, how would they feel, rather than the physical description of the person, so that I don't accidentally stereotype or define a certain group as that portion, so that the story can take on as many legs as it wants. Now, granted, as I develop as a writer, one of the things I did think about, as Fannie was talking about when she was talking about description of the characters, if I'm doing more of a long form story, 100%, I want to really define some of the description of the personality of the character, the physical characteristics, because I feel the deeper I get into a story, the deeper I really want to know what's going on with the characters and how they look, how they feel, so that as I go deeper and deeper, that I feel more connected with the entire environment. So that's what I feel about it, is at least right now in my initial experience, I don't think it's necessary though for short stories.
Okay. I have really mixed feelings about this, which is why I wanted to do
Yeah.
it, because I keep going back and forth. I was fortunate enough to get reviewed by a professional writer, and she reviewed the first 10 pages of my story. And it was so funny because she's like, you have no physical descriptions at all in this novel that I'm writing. And she's like, you need to ground the reader. And then I was thinking more and more about it. And I know I try to avoid physical descriptions because I feel like it allows the reader to stereotype the character and not actually think about what the character is doing. Like one time I wrote a short story about immigration, and the character was in the US for school, and her family had come over for college. And I said her name, and I said her cousin came over from overseas. And when it was in critique group, pretty much like everybody in critique group was like, well, what country was she from? And I was like, that has no bearing on the story itself, because it's
Right.
about her being in America now and how it changed from when she first came over to today, contemporary times. But that was all everybody wanted to know. What is her ethnicity? What was she? Where is she from? And part of me was like, I feel that a lot of the stories I've been reading, I ignore the physical description. Like, I don't even pay any attention. Like, maybe if it's sci-fi and they're an alien race, I might actually pay attention to it. But for the most part, a lot of the stories I read, I feel like it could be anybody doing it. Like when they're like, oh, the golden blonde hair, in my head, I don't see it, because I was like, this person could be anything. It doesn't have to be what the author says. I kind of open myself up to my imagination. So a lot of times when I watch movies, I'm shocked because I'm like, wait. But yeah, so I maybe I'm just strange, but I like a lot of the books. I'm like, I don't know why it's not a Black female. Or, you know, in my head, it could be a Black female main character, even if it's a guy and it's not, you know.
Everyone's a Black female, right?
Everybody's a Black female. If I feel like I could be that character, everybody is a Black female. If I feel like I couldn't be that character, then I'm like, it's somebody else. But, and I don't know, like, when you guys read a story, do you pay attention to the physical descriptions, or do you like envision yourself? Like the blank slate that Matthew was talking about.
Right.
So I do both, I guess. Even with the description, I can still envision myself in it, but I do like to, I'm a very visual person, even learning. I learn visually and I learn by doing it. You can tell me something all day long, but until I actually see it being done or do it myself, you know, I'm just like, oh, okay, whatever. So I like that. I like the author was telling you, I like to be grounded with what the people look like, because then, and I don't need an overflow of detail. You know, I don't need to know that his eyes were, you know, a piercing serling blue, or that, you know, she had D cups or whatever. It's like, that's a little too much information. But I do like to know general information about them, because then it allows me to picture them a little bit more. And I can kind of, I guess, work with what's happening. Is their reaction, I don't want to say typical, but, you know, is that like, why are they reacting like that? That could be my stereotypes coming in. It's like, you know, well, of course she's doing that because she's a white woman, or of course he's saying that because, you know, he's Chinese, or he's African American, whatever. That could be my own stereotypes coming in, but I still like to at least be able to envision what that person looks like. And I'm even still shocked sometimes when, you know, they make a movie about it and it's like, really? That's who you picked?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. We'll go with that choice.
Let's see. I guess for me, I definitely, when I'm reading a book, I if it's more of like a data or research type of book, of course I'm not going to worry about the physical descriptions. But if it's more of a fantasy or a fiction type of story, I love physical description, because I love every single detail of that type of story. If I'm going to read 400, 500 pages of a book, it really gets me drawn in. It really gets me captivated with each character individually. And I try my best to not involve my own stereotypes into it, so that I can take this book in its own like universe and really embrace it for what it's trying to be. But yeah, for, like I was saying before, definitely for reading books, I love it when I can see as many details as possible.
And I think too that there are like really interesting choices with the details that we can share, because I think part of like the meta narrative of what we're talking about is like the prototypical types of ways that we describe things. So like what is the like racial makeup of someone, how tall are they, what color are their eyes, right? All of these things that are like checkboxes. But there's other ways that you can describe things that I think if you take a critical lens to what description is, that can be like much more fruitful. So instead of like telling me what my hand is doing, like tell me about the blister on my hand, right? Like all of these like little things that I think can do a lot more work and are actually fresher than the typical ways that we experience description, and then can also give like the reader at least something to ground them in.
Yeah, to add to that, I think the way you selectively describe the physicality can even be elevated to a level of a voice. Like you look at movies like Amelie or the book, the Curious Case of the Dog, the Upside Down Dog, right? Where this kid is autistic, and so he describes the world in a very specific way, including the physicality. So it's like you were saying earlier, it can be a tool people can use.
Yeah. And that, I think, like when we're talking about stories and we're talking about how we're describing characters, so much of it should be based in the voice of the character. What would they think about? What things would they point out either about themselves, and do those things line up with like how we're describing them in the story?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Matt. I think it also kind of harkens back something when you were talking, reminded me of what Mike was saying also, is, you know, in short stories, maybe the description, the full description isn't as important because you only have, what, 6,000 words or something to work with. So it's the difference of having, you know, $50 a day to spend in Paris, or, you know, $1,000 today. You gotta, to, you know, make that more concise and find different ways to describe it. Maybe you don't talk about their height, but maybe you talk about how they have to, you know, the pants are too short, or they're ducking, you know, when they're going under something. And that way you just save those words, but you're still describing it, but you're doing it in a fresh way where it's not saying, oh, he's tall.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I will add is when you're talking about like the blister on the hand, that was something that I didn't even think about when I was developing the horror story. Is how do you describe when things actually happen to a person? How do you describe like not just mental things, but actually physical, like lacerations or whatever? But how do you describe to a reader when something physically is happening to someone, not only just describing the physical appearance, but also physical marks on their body, but putting it in a way where it's actually engaging? And that was something I really felt I grew as a writer through that process, because that's something I never thought about. I thought that was cool, like thinking about how you can incorporate physical description from that perspective. But yeah.
Yeah, how do you describe when the body goes pop?
I guess I found out there's a lot of ways.
And I think it's important to realize, like, physical description doesn't just have to be visual either. So you can also do the other senses, like auditory, as you were talking about before, Fannie, or like smell, or I don't know, maybe my taste. I'm kidding. Wherever your stories lead.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think layering in, bringing in all the senses, just as much detail as you can add, it just immerses that reader into your world. And now their outside world fades away and they're just focused on your work.
Yeah. It's also more exciting for you as a writer, right? Like you're not just going through the rungs of how you're describing like normal things. You're like having some excitement in that experience too.
Yeah. I took an acting class with Michael Piper in Second City a few months ago, and one of the exercises he would have us lead to develop that kind of emotional intensity is to just start with the physical description, to really try to immerse our own memory or person into that moment. So the same could be said for immersing an audience member, as people have been saying, a reader.
Nice.
Yeah, because I guess writing and acting and all that, we're all trying to portray a story convincingly. And we have to use like the whole mind to experience it and then try to relay it in a way that the reader can actually experience it as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's all the time we have for today. But thank you so much, panelists, for all of your thoughts and insights on this topic. Tune in for the next One Question series video as we continue to explore ideas that may not be as simple as they appear on the surface, and as we help writers and readers make conscious choices. We also want to thank everybody for listening. This is Behind the Volume, a look at Write Volumes in the Making, One Question. Please check our writevolumes.com for our latest info. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions you're curious about and think could be good for our One Question series, please message me at Write Volumes on Twitter or Facebook, or email us at writevolumes@gmail.com, and perhaps your question will be chosen for a video topic. Thanks, everyone, and remember, together we can write volumes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Okay, bye.